is James Gross, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk about my very favorite topic in the entire world, which is emotion regulation. And you know, part of the human condition is just this, that we have emotions, and that sometimes these emotions are tremendously helpful. Feelings like sadness, compassion, fear, anger, and happiness. But at other times, those same emotions are profoundly unhelpful. And it's at those times when emotions are judged to be unhelpful that we need to regulate or influence our emotions. And that's what I want to focus on together today. How we go about regulating our emotions to try to guide our emotions, to enhance and encourage the helpful ones, and to diminish and decrease the less helpful ones. Now, this concern with emotion regulation is very old, dating back thousands of years. In Plato's Phaedrus, for example, we hear about a charioteer struggling to contain and control and direct the steeds representing the emotions. So the idea that we need to influence or regulate our emotions is a very old one. What's new is the empirical work that's been done since the late 1990s. In this plot, I'm showing year by year citation counts for emotion regulation. The blue line, you can see, you wish you would have invested some money in this curve because boy, is this thing going skyward. And a contrast term shows that it's not all terms that are increasing. It seems to be pretty special about emotion regulation. Exponentially increasing to the point where there are tens of thousands of papers on emotion regulation each year. Some time ago, my colleague and friend Sandra Kuhl mentioned that this tremendous increase in research volume has rendered the study of emotion regulation one of the most vibrant areas in contemporary psychology. Notice that quote was from 2009, which was here on the curve. And it's only gone up since. So popularity is a great thing. People are interested in this age-old problem of how we can regulate our emotions. But popularity also masks some confusion about what the heck we're even talking about here. So let's start with some definitions. Emotion regulation refers as an umbrella term to processes that influence which emotions one has, when one has them, and how one experiences and expresses these emotions. It can be defined by the activation of a goal to modify the emotion generative process. So someone's trying to change the emotion. Now, this can involve regulating your own emotions or regulating someone else's emotions, as you might do with a friend or a parent might do with a child. This can also importantly refer to increasing or decreasing negative or positive emotions. So this is a pretty big umbrella covering lots of different processes. So what's the way we can kind of think about organizing our efforts to determine which strategies are helpful and which are less helpful? I'm going to start with a scheme that we've used that's been quite helpful that says that in some situations, we pay attention to certain features of those situations, and that leads us to evaluate what's going on as good for me or bad for me in particular ways. That evaluation leads to a coordinated set of responses, changes in how we feel, how we behave, how our body responds. And it's that package of loosely coupled changes in feelings and behaviors and physiology that constitutes the emotion. And that emotion, in turn, can actually influence the situation that gave rise to it. Another way of drawing the same idea would be to articulate this loop through time, noting that as we move through time, we're slowly changing the situation and thereby changing our emotions as well. The reason I start by sharing this idea is this basic idea about how emotions are generated provides a very helpful framework for thinking about how emotions can be regulated. Because what it says is that there are different pressure points that we might be able to touch to try to change the emotion generative process and thereby change the resultant emotion. Let's now distinguish 5 families of emotion regulation processes. First, one way to regulate emotion is to change the situation that you're exposed to. Situation selection. Which situation am I going to actually put myself in? That'll determine to a large degree what emotions I subsequently have. Second family of regulatory processes, situation modification. Now I'm in the situation. Is there some way I can adjust or influence that situation so as to change my emotions? Third family of regulatory processes. Now I'm in a situation, but I can still shift my attention in a way that will powerfully affect which emotions I have and how those play out. Fourth family of regulatory processes. Again, just following along with how emotions are built. Now we come to a point where I'm in a situation, paid attention, started to think about it or evaluate it in certain ways. And if I can change those ways of thinking or ways of evaluation, I can change my emotions. Finally, the fifth family of regulatory processes refers to fairly late in the day, after I've been in a situation, paid attention, thought about it, I can still modify the emotion output if I want to, and that's called response modulation. So 5 families of emotion regulation processes which derive from a very simple conception of how emotions are built over time. And the idea that I think is really important here is that if emotions are built over time and we can intervene at different time points, it stands to reason that if you can intervene fairly early in the emotion generative process, this might be a higher leverage pressure point. You might have better effects than if you wait till the end of a particular cycle. Researchers around the world have tested these ideas with a particular emphasis on 2 families of regulatory processes. Cognitive change, which affects the evaluation or appraisal process, and response modulation, which affects the output of emotion. And the idea that motivated these studies in our lab and other labs around the world is that even that difference of 1 step might make a world of difference in terms of outcomes. So that if you can catch emotion at the level of your thinking, that might have a bigger impact than if you had to wait until the very end where you're trying to muck around with the output. So let's now summarize hundreds and hundreds of studies for you by first looking at these 2 different types of regulation. Suppression, which is defined as decreasing your ongoing emotion expressive behavior. And the idea that we had, because that's at the very end of the cycle, is it should be pretty hard to do this. And yes, it should tamp down the behavior. That's what you're trying to do. But it shouldn't be very effective in all of these other response components. And we're going to contrast this with reappraisal, a form of cognitive change, which comes 1 step earlier at that evaluation stage, refers to modifying the meaning of a situation so as to decrease the emotion. And our expectation here is that actually just thinking differently should be relatively effortless, but very effective because it's coming a bit earlier. So let's see how these studies have sort of lined up. First, focusing on suppression, which is this type of response modulation all the way at the end of the process. What have we found? We and others have found. Decreased negative emotion expressive behavior, of course, that's what people are trying to do, but it doesn't make you feel better. If anything, it turns out it increases your autonomic responses with no change or actually increases in emotion generative regions such as the amygdala and insula. Here's one early study, and in the couple slides to follow, I'll show you some of the earliest studies from our group, but there have now been dozens and dozens of studies in this space. What you see in this plot is that when watching a fairly upsetting film clip, if you were randomly assigned to suppress, this magnifies your cardiovascular response to the video compared to if you responded naturally. So you see an increase, not a decrease, an increase in physiological response. There's also cognitive costs. If you later ask people, hey, what did I show you, or what did I tell you while you were suppressing? People are a lot stupider when they're suppressing compared to when they're not suppressing. Here's an example study, again, one of the earlier studies done in this space by Jane Richards and myself, showing that memory performance is suppressed in the suppression condition. There are even social costs. So we found that when you measure the blood pressure responses of the person who's suppressing and a partner who's interacting with them but not suppressing, we see that there's elevation in blood pressure, not just in the person who's suppressing, but also in the person who's interacting innocently with this person who's suppressing. Now you might say, James, okay, that's interesting, but these are short-term lab studies. What about longer term, over months or even years? Are there really effects of using suppression? What we and others have found that affectively, individuals who use suppression frequently on a day-to-day basis have worse mood repair, less positive emotion, more negative emotion, and lower levels of well-being than those who use suppression less frequently. What about the social domain? Suppression use seems to be associated with less close relationships. Well, even physical health. Suppression use is associated with higher levels of cardiovascular disease. So this is sounding pretty bleak. Suppression, although sometimes it might be helpful, certainly if you do it day in and day out, it's going to be costly. So what's the alternative? Let's go to this model and remind ourselves that we can go one step earlier and look at reappraisal. What happens when you reappraise? Well, that too turns down your behavior, but guess what? It also makes you feel better. You look cool and you feel good. It decreases your physiological responses. This from Greg Hychuk's lab from a number of years ago. You can see modulation in the late positive potential. There have also been a number of other studies with other biological outcomes. There are no discernible cognitive costs. People's memory is just fine. Social costs, none that we can detect in the lab. And so this is sounding pretty good. But again, you might say, James, what about day in and day out over weeks and months and even years? What about that? Well, turns out that affectively, individuals who use reappraisal and do it frequently have better mood repair, less negative emotion, and greater well-being than those who use reappraisal less frequently. A win for reappraisal. What about socially? Reappraisal use is associated with closer relationships and greater social status. Wow. What about physical health? Are we paying a price here? No, reappraisal use is associated with lower levels of cardiovascular disease. So this is sounding pretty good. Now you might think, James, there's one thing here I need to worry about, which is, are you telling me one story twice, or are these two different stories? And what do I mean by that? Well, if someone who reappraises never suppresses, and someone who suppresses never reappraises, then I'm telling you one story twice. But what we've actually found is that the correlation between your tendency to suppress or your tendency to reappraise is 0. This means that there are two stories. If you want to have lots of great outcomes and few bad outcomes, use reappraisal and don't use suppression very much. What if you want a whole bunch of bad outcomes, which I hope you don't? Well, there you just pile on the suppression and rarely use reappraisal. It's two stories. There's another thing we can worry about, which is that it sort of sounds like I'm a reappraisal cheerleader. It sounds like I think reappraisal is always great. Is that what I'm saying? It's not actually what I'm saying. Instead, what I'd want to say is that reappraisal should be useful in some contexts, but not always useful. For example, we and others have found that reappraisal is less useful when emotions are extremely intense. It's just very difficult to make a dent in an emotion if you get hit really hard with something super intense. For example, in work with Gal Sheps, we found that under low negative emotion conditions, seen on the left here, people preferentially use reappraisal rather than distraction to regulate their emotions. But under conditions of much higher intensity, shown on the right, people switch to use distraction rather than reappraisal. That's because reappraisal doesn't work quite as well under these high intensity conditions. Another thing that colleagues have found in this area is that reappraisal is less useful when the situation can be changed. So if you can do something to fix the situation, that might be better than thinking differently, even though you could have changed a bad situation. In a nice study by Troy and colleagues on the left side, what we can see is that as you move from low stress to high stress, under conditions of high stress, if something is if you're very, very good at reappraisal, that, it turns out, under conditions of very high stress, you couldn't have controlled it, therefore the reappraisal ability, the people that are high are going to be doing really well. They're going to have lower levels of depression, as shown at the bottom line. But let's take a look at the right panel. What happens under conditions where you actually could do something about the situation? Here what we find is actually a crossover, such that as you move from low to high stress, are the people who are using reappraisal under conditions where you could actually do something about it, are they doing better? No, they're not. They may actually be doing a little bit worse. So these findings are very important qualifications to the basic idea that I want to really emphasize here, which is that as we have emotions that are difficult, that may not be working the way we'd like them to, we can, in fact, regulate these emotions. We can influence which emotions we have and how they're experienced or expressed. But how we do this matters intensely. It turns out that some forms of regulation, such as suppression, are quite costly in the laboratory and outside. Turns out that other forms of regulation, such as reappraisal, are much more effective, much less costly, and have a wide range of benefits. But this does not equal always do reappraisal under every circumstance, because, as we've seen, there are times when reappraisal is going to be less effective rather than more effective. So what have we done taking all of these hundreds and hundreds of studies and putting them together? What we've done is to try to find ways, acknowledging the limitations of reappraisal, we've tried to find ways of packaging reappraisal so that it can help people in different circumstances. And what I'd like to do in the next couple minutes is just to talk about a few of these different efforts that we've made. So that in one study, for example, we tried to broaden beyond emotions to ask whether if you can use reappraisal to try to diminish the many temptations that we often feel in everyday life. Is that something we can do to use reappraisal to diminish temptations? We're often tempted to do things we know we're going to later regret. Can we change our thinking so as to diminish that urgency of the temptation? The answer is yes. In couples, in a study led by Eli Finkel, we found that sadly, it's just a normative trajectory to see that relationships decline in satisfaction over time, on average. And one of the questions is, what the heck can be done to decrease that decline? Can you break that decline in satisfaction? And so in that study, we tried to use a reappraisal intervention in couples who were at varying stages in their marriage. And we found that we weren't able to flip the decline to make it actually a positive slope, but we were able to slow that normative decline by randomly assigning couples to use a very short reappraisal, such that every few months they would, as they came into the lab, they would be asked to describe a tough situation that they had with their partner and to try to think about it in a different way. And it turns out that that little intervention and the suggestion that they do similar sort of work to reappraise as they move back into their everyday life, that actually slowed that downward trajectory in satisfaction. So that's a second example of how you might use reappraisal research to help. Broadening beyond individuals or even couples. We also have considered, in work led by Eran Halperin, intractable conflict, taking as a model case the Israel-Palestinian conflict, ongoing intractable conflict. And the question was whether we could use reappraisal in order to help people think in ways that would promote peace. And in several studies now, we found that as impossible as it sometimes seems to move the dial with respect to intractable conflict, that a simple reappraisal manipulation, asking people to think differently, training them with a brief training, leads to changes not only in how upset they are, but also in their sense of how likely it is that we might be able to find a path to lasting peace. Moving to another domain, parents. This is something many of us can relate to, particularly during this COVID pandemic era. It's been so difficult on parents and families and kids. And what we have been very interested in is building interventions to help parents regulate their emotions in these incredibly difficult times. One example of this work is led by Yael Inav in Israel, and she's building interventions to try to help particularly challenged parents, parents with children with special needs, children with autism spectrum disorder, which creates some challenges for the parents and the families. And these interventions show very promising initial results. We've also, in a much broader context, again focused now here directly on COVID, Qi Wang led a project where we took thousands of people around the world, many, many different countries and regions, and we assigned a brief reappraisal manipulation, or we assigned control conditions. This is in the context of COVID. It was done by the internet, and we found that we were able to increase positive emotion and decrease negative emotion, even in the context of COVID. Ongoing work, very interested in applying some of these principles, not just to parents, but also to kids themselves and adolescents who are struggling, these days in particular, with anxiety and depression. And one emotion that's been particularly compelling to us is anger, trying to see whether we can help regulate anger, particularly when it reaches very high intensity levels, as in the case of road rage. And with work led by Johan Djurberg, we're finding very promising effects there. So in sum, what I've hoped to show you is that our emotions are very much a crucial part of what it is to be human. Sometimes these emotions are to be celebrated and are helpful and are really great. But at other times, these emotions occurring at the wrong intensity, the wrong type, the wrong time can drag us down. And what I've tried to show, and what the emotion regulation field is working to find, is solutions, strategies that we can use to influence which emotions we have, when we have them, and how these emotions are experienced and expressed. Strategies that'll be helpful and healthy and productive rather than harmful and destructive. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you so much for your attention.